Whitefell Moor was the kind of place people only mentioned when they were warning you not to go there. A wide stretch of bleak northern moorland, it sat between two counties and belonged to neither. In summer, hikers crossed it without incident. In winter, it became something else entirely. A vast, white nothing where sound died and landmarks vanished. On the night of January 14th, the weather forecast promised heavy snow but nothing out of the ordinary. That forecast was wrong. Bus number 62 left Manchester at 7:55 p.m., heading for the scattered villages beyond the moor. It was the last scheduled service before midnight, and the last anyone would ever see. Alan Brooks had driven that route for 23 years. At 52, he knew every bend, every signpost, every stone wall buried beneath the snow. He had driven through storms before, blizzards that rattled the bus and coated the windscreen in ice, but he had never failed to finish the route. That night, as he pulled out of the depot, he felt uneasy for reasons he couldn't explain. The air was too still. Snow was already falling, thick and silent, swallowing the city lights behind him. By the time he reached the edge of the moor, visibility had dropped to less than 20 meters. Only 7 passengers were aboard. A young couple heading home after a late shift, an elderly woman with a shopping trolley, 2 teenage lads with headphones, a middle-aged man clutching a briefcase, and a woman in a long dark coat who hadn't spoken since boarding. The radio crackled with weather warnings, then fell silent altogether. Alan tightened his grip on the wheel. Into the blizzard. By 9:30 p.m., Whitefell Moor had disappeared. The road vanished beneath drifting snow, its edges erased. The bus headlights cut tunnels through the storm, but the light never seemed to reach anything solid. Snow didn't fall. It moved sideways violently, like it was being thrown. Alan slowed to a crawl. The elderly woman stood up, gripping a seat. "Are we nearly there?" "Soon," Alan lied. The truth was harder to admit. The road markers were gone. The stone posts that guided drivers across the moor were buried. Without them, even experienced locals could lose their way. Then the bus lurched. The wheels spun uselessly, sinking into a hidden drift. Alan tried reversing. Nothing. Forward. Nothing. The engine whined and died. Silence followed. Heavy and unnatural, broken only by the wind screaming outside. The bus was stuck. The first sound. First, no one spoke. Snow hammered the roof. Ice crept across the windows in delicate, crawling patterns. Then came the sound. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. They came from outside the bus. Slow, deliberate, circling. One of the teenagers pulled out his earphones. "Is someone out there?" Alan leaned forward, heart pounding. He flicked on the high beams. Nothing. Just swirling snow. The footsteps stopped. Alan told himself it was drifting ice, branches, anything logical. But Whitefell Moor had no trees. No fences. Nothing that could walk. A moment later, something tapped the side of the bus. 3 sharp knocks. The elderly woman screamed. Alan stood, gripping the door handle. "Hello?" he called. No answer. He opened the door. The cold slammed into him like a living thing. Snow poured inside, biting at his face. Outside, the world was empty, flat, white, endless. But on the snow beside the bus were footprints.
Bare footprints.
Human. They circled the bus once, twice, then ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. Alan slammed the door shut. The radio message. The bus heater failed. Breath turned visible. Fingers numbed. Fear settled in. Alan tried the radio again. Static burst to life, harsh and loud. Then a voice emerged. Weak, broken, terrified. Bus 62. If you hear this, do not leave the bus. Passengers froze. Whitefell listens. The voice continued. It hears you when you walk. The transmission cut out. No one spoke after that. After an hour, panic took hold. The middle-aged man with the briefcase stood up. We can't sit here all night. I'll walk to the village. Alan blocked the aisle. You step out there, you won't come back. I won't freeze to death in here. Before Alan could stop him, the man pulled on his coat and forced the door open. The blizzard swallowed him instantly. For 5 minutes, they watched through the windows as his torchlight bobbed away, growing dimmer, smaller, until it vanished. They waited. 10 minutes. 20. Then the torchlight reappeared. Close. Too close. It hovered just beyond the reach of the headlights, swaying gently. Someone called his name. The light went out. The man never returned. The second and third. Fear turned to desperation. The two teenagers decided to go together. Safety in numbers, they said. They tied a scarf between them so they wouldn't get separated. Alan begged them to stay. They didn't listen. They stepped into the storm and disappeared. Less than a minute later, the scarf drifted back toward the bus. Empty. No blood.
No footprints.
Just fabric, gently dragged by the wind. The woman in the dark coat began to cry softly. Then she laughed. Alan noticed then that she was mouthing words, counting. 3, she whispered. It likes 3. The blizzard worsened. Something began moving beneath the snow, shapes rising and falling, as if the ground itself was breathing. Knocking resumed, louder now, more insistent. Not on the doors, on the roof. 1 knock, 2, 3. The elderly woman collapsed from cold and fear. The young couple huddled together, whispering prayers. The woman in the dark coat stood and faced the windows. It's learned, she said calmly. It remembers the lost. Alan watched as shapes formed in the snow outside, vague outlines of people standing just beyond the lights. They didn't move. They just waited. Then the bus rocked violently. Something pushed it. Again and again. Alan locked the doors and turned off the lights. Darkness filled the bus. In that darkness he heard breathing, not from the passengers. From everywhere. Morning. Rescue teams reached Whitefell Moor at dawn. The blizzard had passed. They found bus 62 half buried in snow, doors sealed shut. Inside was Alan Brooks, alive, frozen stiff, eyes wide open. He was the only one. No bodies were found. No tracks leading away. Passengers' coats, bags, and shoes lay neatly on the seats, untouched. Alan never spoke again. He died 6 months later in a care facility, waking every night screaming about footsteps in the snow. Local folklore says that during severe blizzards, drivers still see headlights crossing Whitefell Moor, a bus with no passengers. And if you listen closely, beneath the wind, you can hear footsteps following behind it. Barefoot, patient, and never alone. Stonehaven Lodge stood alone on the edge of the North Yorkshire moors, far from villages, roads, or mobile signal. It had been empty for years before Emily Harper found it online. A remote winter retreat, the listing said.
No neighbors. No distractions.
Just silence. Emily and her partner, Thomas Reed, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late January. Snow dusted the hills lightly, nothing more than a picturesque inconvenience. The forecast promised cold nights and flurries, but no storms. By evening, the snow had thickened. By nightfall, it had begun to howl. The wind screamed across the moor, shaking the windows as though something outside wanted to be let in. Emily laughed it off at first. "Feels like we're in a ghost film," she said, lighting candles as the electricity flickered. At 11:17 p.m., the power went out completely. The cottage fell into darkness. They wrapped themselves in blankets and decided to sleep early. The storm sounded fierce, but still ordinary until the phone rang. The sound was sharp and sudden, cutting straight through the wind. Emily sat upright. "Did you hear that?" The old landline on the hallway table rang again. They stared at it in disbelief. The owner had told them the line was disconnected years ago. Thomas picked it up. Silence. Then breathing. Slow. Controlled. Close. Emily felt her stomach twist. A voice followed, faint and hoarse, as if forced through ice. "Keep the door shut." The line went dead. Neither of them slept after that. The blizzard arrives. By morning, the cottage was surrounded. Snow pressed against the windows like packed sand. The road they had driven in on had vanished beneath a white wall. Thomas tried his mobile, no signal. The car door wouldn't open. It was frozen solid. The radio crackled briefly with weather alerts before cutting out altogether. "Blizzard conditions," the announcer said. "Do not attempt travel." Emily made tea with the gas stove, hands trembling. She couldn't shake the feeling that the phone call hadn't been a prank. Outside, the wind carried something else now. A distant knocking sound, irregular and hollow. That afternoon, Emily noticed footprints in the snow. They led from the open moor to the front door. Bare feet. No marks leading away. Thomas dismissed it. "Probably foxes," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. At dusk, the phone rang again. Thomas answered immediately. The same breathing. The same voice. "It walks when the snow deepens." "Who is this?" Thomas demanded. A pause. "Someone who opened the door." The call ended. Midnight. The second night was colder. The fire burned low. Frost crept along the walls. Emily lay awake, listening to the wind batter the cottage like waves against a cliff. At exactly 12 a.m., the phone rang. 3 times. Emily answered this time. "Please," she whispered. "What do you want?" The voice sounded nearer now. Not through the receiver, but inside the room. "It doesn't knock when it's close." The front door creaked. Emily dropped the phone. Something brushed past the windows, tall, slow, scraping. Snow slid from the roof as though something heavy had climbed up there. Thomas grabbed a torch and moved toward the door. "Don't," Emily hissed. There came a soft, patient knock. Once, twice, 3 times. The handle rattled gently. Then nothing. The thing in the snow. Morning brought no relief. The storm showed no sign of easing. Thomas opened the curtains and stepped back in horror. A shape lay half-buried in snow just beyond the doorstep. A man, frozen solid. His eyes were open. His mouth was stretched wide in a silent scream. Emily recognized him immediately, the face from the framed photograph on the cottage shelf. The previous owner, Thomas, retched. Then the frozen man's fingers twitched. Emily screamed as the body shifted, cracking ice from its joints. The phone rang. Neither of them moved. It rang until it stopped on its own. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, more impatient. The windows frosted over completely, sealing them in. From beneath the floorboards came the sound of breathing. Deep, slow, patient. The door. The third night, the storm finally began to weaken. The phone rang one last time. Thomas answered. "You survived," the voice said. "It's hungry now." "What is it?" Thomas whispered. A pause. "Winter doesn't like to be ignored." A heavy thud struck the front door. The hinges groaned. Emily pulled Thomas back just as the door burst inward. Snow poured into the cottage, swirling violently. Standing in the doorway was a shape made of ice and shadow, its outline almost human but wrong, too tall, too still. Behind it, more figures stood in the storm. Frozen faces, open eyes, those who had answered, those who had opened the door. After, rescue teams reached Stonehaven Lodge 2 days later. They found Emily and Thomas alive, suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. The front door was intact. No sign of forced entry. No bodies outside. The phone line was still disconnected. Emily refuses to answer telephones after midnight. Locals say Stonehaven Lodge rings every winter during heavy snow. And if someone answers, winter remembers. Glenrowan Academy stood on the edge of the Scottish Highlands, where the land rose into bleak hills and the wind never truly rested. Built in the late 19th century, the stone boarding school had survived wars, fires, and decades of neglect. What it had not survived, according to locals, was winter. The blizzard of February 1994 was not forecast. It arrived suddenly, violently, and without mercy. By the time the first warning reached the school, it was already too late. Glenrowan Academy housed 18 pupils that term, children whose parents lived too far away to collect them early. Alongside them were 4 teachers, including the headmaster, Arthur Bell, a strict but deeply traditional man who believed routine was the only thing that kept order in isolated places. When the snow began, it was gentle, romantic even. Classes continued as normal. The children watched flakes drift past the tall windows while copying sums and dates from blackboards.
Bells rang.
Registers were taken. The school day unfolded exactly as it always had. By afternoon, the snowfall thickened. Drifts formed against the doors. The caretaker reported that the access road was already becoming impassable. Headmaster Bell dismissed concerns. "We've endured worse," he said. "Lessons will continue tomorrow." That night the wind rose. The old building groaned as if alive. Day 2, isolation. By morning, Glenrowan Academy was sealed off. Snow had piled halfway up the ground floor windows. The radio crackled with broken reports of blocked roads and stranded villages before falling silent altogether. No telephone signal reached the school. Breakfast was served late due to frozen pipes. The children were restless but excited. A snow day, they assumed. They were wrong. When morning register was taken, something strange occurred. Miss Calder, the English teacher, read aloud the names. Each child answered, present and accounted for. When she finished, the register pen moved. On its own. A line appeared beside one empty name, Elliot Fraser, a boy who had died of pneumonia 2 winters earlier. Miss Calder laughed nervously and blamed the cold on her eyes. But at lunchtime another name appeared. Then another. By evening, the register showed 22 pupils present. The first bell. That night the bell rang. Not the handbell used by staff, but the old iron bell fixed above the main hall, the one no longer connected to anything. It rang once, then again. The sound echoed through the corridors, deep and hollow. Students peered from dormitory doors. Teachers searched the hall. The bell rope hung still. Headmaster Bell ordered everyone back to bed. At 2:14 a.m., the bell rang again, followed by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the boys' dormitory. Slow, even, measured, as if someone were counting. Day 3, the missing. The blizzard intensified. Snow hammered the roof so violently it sounded like stones. The temperature inside dropped dangerously low. When staff went to wake the pupils, 5 were gone. Beds were neatly made. Slippers lined beside them. No signs of struggle. In classroom 3B, the blackboard had been filled overnight. Written repeatedly in chalk. Attendance must be taken. The headmaster's composure finally cracked. He ordered an evacuation attempt. The front gates were buried beneath ice. The rear exit opened only to a sheer wall of snow, taller than any man. No one was getting out. That afternoon, students began hearing voices. Laughter. Children's laughter. It came from beneath the snow-covered playground. Muffled. Distorted. Constant. One girl, Hannah Moore, pressed her ear to the frozen ground. "They're playing," she said quietly. They never stopped. Teachers pulled the children away. The bell rang again. Twice. 3 times. Every time it rang, another name appeared in the register. The class that continued. At dusk, Miss Calder entered classroom 3B and froze. Desks were occupied. Children sat upright, facing forward. Some she recognized. Some she did not. Their clothes were old-fashioned. Their skin pale and cracked, as though preserved by cold. At the front of the room, chalk moved across the board. A lesson was being written. Winter term, lesson 1. The children turned their heads toward her in perfect unison. The bell rang. Miss Calder ran. She never returned. The final transmission. That night, Headmaster Bell managed to reach emergency services through a shortwave radio kept in storage. His voice shook as he spoke. "We are trapped. Children are disappearing. Attendance won't stop." Static swallowed his words. Behind him, bells rang throughout the building. Classroom bells, hallway bells, bells that hadn't been used in decades. He turned. The hall was full. Children lined the walls in perfect rows. Silent. Waiting. The radio crackled one final time. "Attendance confirmed," a child's voice said calmly. Transmission ended. Rescue. 3 days later, the storm broke. Rescue teams reached Glenrowan Academy expecting survivors. They found none. The school was warm. Fires burned in the hearths. Meals sat untouched in the dining hall. Registers lay open on desks. All names were marked present, including those of children who had died over the last 100 years. The bell rang once as rescuers stepped inside. They left immediately. Glenrowan Academy was sealed by government order. Officially, the occupants were declared lost to exposure. Unofficially, locals tell a different story. They say Glenrowan was never meant to close during winter, that the school was built over older ground, a place where seasons demanded payment. Every blizzard, lights appear in the windows. Bells ring on the hour, and if you stand close enough, you can hear children reciting lessons beneath the snow. Attendance is still taken, and it is never 0.